Well, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, whatever it is for you. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me today, and we are once again discussing the book He Shines in All That's Fair by Richard Mouw. And this is Generous Theology. I suppose I should start right at the top with the name of our show, Generous Theology. This is Generous Theology with Chuck and Brock. But yes, on our Thursday conversations for us, it might be some other day for you, we have been reading sort of an alternate book to our regular Reformed dogmatics. And today we are in chapter 5 of 6 of He Shines in All That's Fair by Richard Mouw. And it's a wonderful, thin little book. Highly recommended. You know, if you're listening to us and you haven't actually read it, I'd grab this book and read it. It's wonderful. And in specifically to this chapter, Brock, I know that you said as we were just sort of pre-gaming and talking a little bit before we got started, that this is just really an inspiring chapter, very enjoyable to read. There's a little bit of insider language, I think, in some of the other chapters specific to some denominational issues, and you've heard us talk about those if you've been listening to us as we've discussed this book. But this chapter, that insider stuff is past us now, and this really is a lot of discussion about how do we seek the common good, and how do Calvinist believers apply this idea of common grace in that concept of seeking the common good. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. And I know Christians don't always agree on exactly what it means to seek the common good and what role Christians should have. My grandfather, who really became a Christian as an adult, probably not much younger than I am now when he became a Christian. He had been raised in a nominally Catholic family where usually the women were devout and the men were not. And he, as a result of my grandmother first being converted, he also was. And he got very, very into, what does it mean to be a Christian and how should we as Christians act in the world? And I think in part because of his experience having lived in what he called the pagan world, he was somewhat sensitive and careful and was concerned that Christians would dirty themselves or sully themselves if they got too involved in seeking the common good. And so he often took the position that, maybe we should just step back, hang out with fellow Christians, deal with our own institutions and not get too involved in the world. He did not think that Christians should really be involved in politics. He often questioned whether he even wanted to vote. I believe most of the time he did, but it was something that he deeply thought about. My own father, his oldest son, who really became a Christian around that same time, but was a little younger. And my dad was definitely influenced by what was going around him in the world as well. He came of age during the 1960s. He was a 1964 high school graduate, a 1968 college graduate. And so these were times of turmoil and the hippies and people who were countercultural. And he became a Christian during that time. And that had an impact on him as well. And he ended up taking a very different tack on it and saying, look, we as Christians have to be involved. We have to understand what is the world talking about? What we have to be involved in our communities. We have to go beyond merely our Christian communities. It's important for Christians to be involved in politics and journalism and all sorts of things where sometimes traditionally Christians weren't necessarily involved. He became very interested in people like Abraham Kuyper, who, was a Dutch theologian, who was also a journalist, who was also a politician, was also a pastor, did all sorts of things. And I remember my dad and my grandpa having lengthy conversations. We'd have family get-togethers, And often my dad and his brothers and my grandpa and my grandma and some of the aunts and my mom would kind of be there too. But in this case, it was very often my dad and my grandpa who were the primary discussers, and they'd go head to head. They would argue, and to the point where, and I've maybe told this story. I remember how we were sitting one summer in my grandparents' garage. They moved the car out of the garage. It was enough room to sit, and we could all kind of sit out there, and there was a little bit of a breeze going on. But I remember her shutting the window because she was worried the neighbors would hear this loud discussion that was going on. And it was always a good discussion. To this day, my grandpa passed many years ago. He died in 1988. My father died a number of years ago as well after a car accident. Actually, my grandmother lived longer than he did. And so both of them have been gone for quite some time. But, I've talked to my uncles and some of my cousins, and we talk about how we miss those days. We missed that time when we could have those real head-to-head discussions. But there was also a sense that my grandpa and my dad were pretty good at doing it and going head-to-head without necessarily, knocking each other's brains out, which is a good thing. And I still do remember, too, my grandfather at the end of those conversations saying, well, I'm probably going to die and go to heaven before the rest of you, and you'll come to heaven and you'll see I was right. And a lot of times that discussion that he was convinced he was right about was about at what point, where is it appropriate for Christians to be involved in seeking the common good, and where should we sort of step back? It's interesting now that in recent years, and this discussion really happened, it was before my father passed, but after he had lost many of his mental abilities as a result of that car accident he was in, that there's been discussion of the Benedict option. And you've probably heard a little bit about the Benedict option, Brock, which is this idea that Christians may want to sort of gather together and, protect their own institutions, create their own institutions at a time when maybe the world is really in opposition to them. And that idea, it's interesting because in some ways, I think my grandfather would have been very, very much a proponent of the Benedict option. My father probably would have been less so. And yet, in many ways, both of them were involved in projects that some people might say they sound very Benedict option-y to me. My grandfather very much was a big supporter of his local Christian school, Oostburg Christian School. When he passed, that's where the memorial funds were to go to. He wanted to make sure that students from the school were there at his memorial service and singing, that kind of thing. My father as well was a big supporter of Christian education from, preschool all the way up. He taught at a Christian university, served on the board of a Christian high school, and was lived in a community, Sioux Center, Iowa, that some people say is sort of the Benedict option already in place. and yet in that discussion, there then becomes the question of, okay, even if we're going to sort of come together in this Benedict option-like community, what do we do that for? Is the primary reason we do that for us, or do we do it because we are seeking the common good so that we can, as a pastor I once had described it, gather and scatter, right? You gather together to do some things together as Christians because it's useful to do that, and then you scatter out. My father often liked to shock people a little bit by using imagery of what Islam often does in creating madrasas. And he would say, of course, we're not doing the same thing as they're doing, but these Islamic madrasas were places where people would come and they would focus on the Quran, they'd focus on Islamic theology, and then they'd go out into the rest of the world. And he said, what the Muslims have right is that idea that you're gathering first and then going out. And he often used to say that maybe we ought to have more Christian madrasas, although it would look very different than perhaps some of the Islamic madrasas. We're not out there to physically conquer or to establish some kind of a Christian version of jihad, but rather to seek the common good, so that everyone in the communities we scatter into, whether they're Muslim or Jewish or secular, whatever it is, we recognize that there's benefit and that we're honoring sort of who they are and their humanity and their part in the community as well. Brock, you mentioned, how much you appreciated this chapter as well. And before we sort of dive into some of the specific topics, and there are some really good specific topics here in this chapter, just interested a little bit too in sort of your general overview. What was it that really excited you about this chapter? And was there anything either new to you or things that really maybe were the next step from some of the things we've read earlier in this book?
Yeah, thank you, my friend. I think what was perhaps so inspiring to me about this chapter is that it articulates a very mature expression of something that has been building inside of me for many years, that I didn't know quite how to put in such an edifying way. And let me give some backstory. So the first 20 years of my Christian life, I've been a believer now for about 45, 47 years. First 20-ish of so I was not reformed. At least let me say it this way. I was not reformed in terms of understanding doctrines. Of course, I would say that I was proto-reformed. All the pieces were there for me to then become reformed. But I didn't know the doctrines. It was not saved in a reformed church. I did not go when I went to churches that were reformed, like Presbyterian churches and some of the Baptist churches. They did not emphasize or they de-emphasized the reformed aspects of their legacy. For example, I was in a Presbyterian church where I love to go through the libraries. And so I went through the libraries one day and I found this old book in this dusty corner that no one had looked at, obviously, for a long time. And I pulled it down and it talked about this thing called the Westminster Confession. And I pulled it down. I showed it to some of my elders, the minister in the Presbyterian church. What's this Westminster Confession thing? I was so excited. I read a little bit about it, didn't understand much, but was intrigued. I kid you not, Chuck. They took the book from my hand and then hid it from me and said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We don't talk about that anymore." I kid you not. And I think I talked with one of the elders. "Oh, that's what we used to believe." With this very sort of clear tone of, we're now so much more enlightened as to believe something better. And so I didn't find Reformed theology at that time. Could have found it 10 to 15 years earlier had someone told me what was in that book. But anyway, so I find Reformed theology. I start studying it. I come online. I meet my fellow brothers and sisters who are Calvinists, Reformed theology. This is on social media. Still wasn't plugged into a local church yet. But I was kind of like, some people who remember the movie Tommy Boy are going to remember, Tommy Boy is introduced to his new older brother in the film, and the older brother is just like, oh, he has such contempt. He's so much better than Tommy Boy. Tommy Boy isn't his real brother, and he wants nothing to do with him. And I'm kind of like Tommy Boy, the character played by Chris Farley in that film on social media. I'm kind of like running up to Calvinists in social media, and I'm kind of like, brothers, gotta hug, which is a famous line from Tommy Boy, where Tommy Boy wraps up his older brother who wants nothing to do with him. And that was my introduction to the Calvinist online community. And it's so much of it has sustained that tone, and much of it hasn't. So let me just move on there. But all I mean to say is this: there was this strong stridency in Calvinist circles when I came online that we were almost to be crusaders. And that crusader image is a big thing with some Calvinists, with some Reformed folks. And they would picture themselves wearing crusader armor and, swinging swords and slashing infidels. And except here's the thing, the infidels were the other people in our culture. And I just thought about it, and I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm friends with a lot of those infidels, and I'm not saying they're Christians, and I'm not saying I agree with their doctrine, but this whole idea that there's something for us to conquer didn't quite sit well. And so when I thought about it over the years, I tried to put it into words, and I think the closest I got to was something that Mouw references in this chapter. And I'm going to read from this. This is from Jeremiah, chapter 29. And of course, the situation that I'm talking about is the post-political kingdom, when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, conquers the kingdom of Judah and ends its political reign and rule. And the people are carted off, the ones who survived, who are carted off into exile. And in Jeremiah chapter 29, Jeremiah writes a letter to these people. And he says this. I'm going to read it slightly out of order, but to make the point. You will be in Babylon for 70 years. This is Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10. But then I will come and do for you all the good things I have promised, and I will bring you home again. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans for good and not disaster, to give you a future and a hope. In those days, when you pray, I will listen. If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. I will be found by you, says the Lord. I will end your captivity and restore your fortunes. And then it says a little bit earlier in verse 5. This is what the Lord says to the captives he has exiled to Babylon. Build homes, plan to stay, plant gardens, eat the food they produce, marry and have children. Find spouses for them so that you may have many grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away. And now here it comes, verse 7. Work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Then he says this, pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. It's no secret that in the 50, 60 years after the Second World War, Protestant America, in some sense, was the king of the hill. I still wish it were, but it's not. And in some sense, we Protestants have been sent into exile in our own culture. We once were a cultural majority. We're still a significant cultural influence, but we don't have this stranglehold. It used to be that Christians could come together and boycott businesses. And boy, that would whip those businesses into shape. Well, recent years, the shoe's on the other foot now. And I can't help but think, gee, maybe all of those boycotts that Christians did in years past, maybe they weren't the force for good that we thought they were at the time. And I just have this sense, even though I would love for the nation to return to the best of what some people today call a Christian nationalism, at the same point in time, I really get a sense that the genie is out of the bottle. And while I want to strive for goodness and wholesomeness in the culture, I also don't want to insist on a crusading Christian nationalism. And so in this chapter from Professor Mouw, he's asking the question that I'm asking, that I've been asking. What is the case for Christian civility? He says this, he says, two important principles. Christians must actively work for the well-being of the larger societies in which they have been providentially placed. And then secondly, sanctified living should manifest those virtues that will motivate us in our efforts to promote societal health. And so, Chuck, I don't want to completely put us into the status of a conquered people, and yet I want to live among and minister to the non-Christians, the secular society, which is now a cultural majority in our society. I want to do good by them. I want to live in their society. And that means I have to put away a little bit of my desire to rule over them. And so Mouw is articulating this case for a Christian civility that I think, echoes my own heart. And I wish more of our Reformed brothers, at least the ones I encounter on social media, the ones waving the swords and wearing the crusader armor and such. I wish I could introduce them to that vision that Professor Mouw has here. What do you think of that opening and build out?
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Brock, because I think, one of the things that Mouw does here in sort of this laying out of these principles, that, as you mentioned, that we actively work for the well-being of the larger society in which we've been placed, but that also sanctified living should manifest those virtues that motivate us in those efforts to promote societal health. And in sort of putting those two principles together, Mouw points to 1 Peter 2 as really a strong basis for living out those principles in the world. And earlier I was talking a little bit about how my father and my grandfather sometimes represented somewhat different poles of this idea of either we're there to be out in the world for the betterment of the world versus we're meant to sort of gather together to really focus on sanctified living. And what Mouw says is it doesn't have to be, one pole here and one pole here. It doesn't have to be we're either living the Benedict option or we're living a life of common grace, triumphalistic, neo-Calvinism, but rather there's a place where both of these actually meet. And he uses 1 Peter and references to the Old Testament as well to talk about that. He says, the Apostle Peter urges believers, conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, but also accept for the Lord's sake the authority of every human institution. So our obligation, Mouw says, to manifest honorable conduct doesn't mean that we should do whatever will please everyone in the large society. Rather, fellow citizens, might malign you as evildoers. But the important thing is to act in such a way that unbelievers may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. And in talking about the context of that, Peter establishes that by talking about this particular group of New Testament believers as the exiles of the dispersion. And in doing that, what he's doing is he's alluding to Christians as being aliens and exiles, thinking about that Old Testament idea of Old Testament Israel being a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, who are then placed into exile. They go into exile from the promised land. They're taken over by the Babylonians. And even in that context of, exile, they're called to seek the good of the city. And so Peter's comments here in 1 Peter 2 really give a direct parallel to those things in Jeremiah 29. And so Mouw says, the prophet gives them their new instructions for exiled living. And these are instructions in many ways for us as well, as exiles, as strangers, as aliens who are not necessarily of this world. He says that our instructions for exiled living are to construct dwellings for ourselves, to plant crops for our sustenance, to enter into marriages and encourage our sons and daughters to do the same so that we might bear children and increase their numbers in the land, and seek the welfare, seek the shalom of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its shalom, in its welfare, you will find your shalom. You will find your welfare. It doesn't mean we don't lose a sense of our strong identity as God's people, as God's elect. And, just as that was the case in the old Israel at the time of Babylon, Peter says this applies just as much to the exiled Christian community. We abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. And in spelling out the four obligations of our lives in the new Israel, Peter chooses verbs that highlight our primary identity. We're to fear God above all. We're to love the family of believers, and then describes what we owe both the emperor and our fellow citizens in the much larger society, using those same the same verb twice, the verb to honor, to have regard for the well-being of other human beings. And Mouw says it is that honor we give even to the pagans around us. That honor is at the heart of what it means to have Christian civility. And Peter calls on us to cultivate that in other ways. He says, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Just actually in the last day or two, I've been watching some conversations, online conversations in an email list where, what you've described a little bit earlier sort of comes out, that there's the sense that sometimes people are crusading and battling, and a wise pastor in the group pointed actually to this particular part of 1 Peter 3 verses 15 and 16, reminding those who were involved in this discussion that it is really important to engage the world around us with gentleness and with reverence. And, I think, unfortunately, sometimes we miss doing that. We become so involved in really what is the way that the world deals with these things, and we sort of copy that in sort of doing our own, righteous thing about, trying to promote the kingdom. And we start behaving in ways that are prideful or don't exhibit sort of that gentleness and reverence and shall I say humility. There's a sense in which being humble and meek is a really important part of who we are as Christians. And by being gentle, by being reverent, we're showing that meekness that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the kingdom of God." That meekness, that humility, often can be a way that we we can approach the world around us in a way that's very different than they're used to, and that turns their heads, causes them to maybe pay attention and say, what is different about this? I was reminded a little bit as well, there's been some discussion. There's a historian by the name of Tom Holland, and while he's not a Christian, he has expressed great appreciation for the Christian tradition. And one of the things that he talks about is how early Christians really did turn the Roman Empire on its head. The Roman Empire was all about, confronting and power and grabbing all the power that we can. And Christians lived very humbly. They took in the children that were abandoned to die out on the outskirts of the city. They stayed in the city when diseases passed through and cared for the people who were left and were unable to take care of each other. And because of that, Christianity grew and grew and grew because A, people saw that this was something different and were attracted to it, and B, people were helped. People received the benefit of that love that Christians showed and became a part of that community as well. And I think that's what Mouw is talking about here, that gentleness, that honor, that humility is really the way that for Christians to really make a difference and to show off God's glory rather than promoting our own glory. And so I really appreciated how Mouw laid out these principles and really kind of showed us a pathway for living in this world that doesn't sort of set as enemies these two sort of principles, one that we want to engage in the world and the other that we have to live righteous lives, but rather puts them together and says they go together. They don't have to be opposites.
Building on that, there's a section in here that I really respect. Professor Mouw talks about, in the section on Calvinist empathy, our dear friends who perhaps would like to see more of the crusading element in society offer a sharp and very real concern for this go along and get along approach. And that is, of course, is that many of them worry that perhaps we might be too accommodating, that perhaps we might, in fact, be compromising because it's easy to do. It's always easier to get along than it is to confront popular sin. And Chuck, I absolutely feel the force of that criticism. So I want our friends who want something sharper, I want them to know that I'm not just intending to compromise because it's easy and gets me out of the hard work of the Christian life. Having said that, I find that very difficult. I find that a very difficult line to draw. I'll just share a couple of examples. Most companies in the last 5 or 10 years have adopted corporate standards of conduct that insist that there are certain protected classes, and some of those protected classes would protect classes of people whom we traditional Christians would say are in sin for being in that protected class. And under the old situation, under the old Protestant hegemony, there was an ability to really resist that. However, we're in a culture now that has frankly become more accommodating. And I expect it to do more of that in the future. So this takes us back to the question that Francis Schaeffer asked: how then shall we live? And I don't know that I have an easy answer here. One of the things that's been difficult has been the accusation of hatred. And I don't have an easy answer to diffuse that societal tactic, let's say, because really that's what's been able to successfully push the boundaries. As these new groups have become protected classes, there's been a presumption that to disagree with people in the protected classes is to have a hatred toward them. And Chuck, I never saw that coming. I never saw success 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when this came on the horizon. I just never thought that pointing at Christians and saying, if you don't agree with my understanding of what love is, then you are a hater. You have hatred in your heart. I never thought that would catch on the way that it did. I still would like to make the case today that in holding to the values that I hold to, that there's no hatred or animus towards people in those groups. And yet, I know that I'm in a culture where that is not acceptable. So what to do? And the short answer is, I don't know. It's the same thing also with witnessing, not just the protected classes, but just in general. When I wanted to talk to people about the Lord, one of the tactics that non-believers would say is they would say, oh, listen, Mr. Christian, I'd love to talk with you about the Lord Jesus, but not now. This is not the right time. This is not the right venue. This is not the right occasion. And at first I would be like, well, listen, I have the right to speak about these topics in various locations. And it's not fair to ask you to put my apologetics in a box. But again, I have seen through the decades of doing this that if I do not respect that boundary, people will not want to talk and engage. And so I have invested in trying to find the right venue. There's a proverb that says, how does it go? Right words, fitly spoken, are like apples on a silver plate. Meaning you bring the right message at the right time. And I really want to do that in the culture because it demonstrates not just an accommodation or a weakness, but it also demonstrates this commitment to being Christian in the best sense. We bring the message to where it's welcomed. The Lord Jesus would send out his disciples and he would say, go to a home, speak peace over it. If the peace returns to you and you're not received, go to the next place. And I think there's some aspect of that going on. But Chuck, I'm throwing out a bunch of different ideas here that are potentially competing. So if somebody else reads the scriptures and they come to a reformed position and they think they want to be more strident, then we really have to have that conversation and that discussion. So Mouw captures so much of my heart and my spirit behind this. And that's what really, as I mentioned to you before we started, that's what really inspired me in this chapter, was to have this mature articulation of, my own heart in this matter. So how is it for you, Chuck? How do you want to balance, for lack of a better word, the crusading sword with the hands of the healer?
It's interesting, as I think this may be a common story that, when I was younger, I was maybe a little more of a crusader, and now that I'm older, I'm a little less of a crusader, and finding different ways to approach some of those things. And there's probably some wisdom in that part of the reason that we're not just the same throughout our whole lives, but that we do age. We start as babies, and we're children, and we're teenagers, and we're young adults, and middle age, and older adulthood, and then we're elderly, and I'm fastly approaching that one. Not quite there yet. There is, I think, some strength in that, and there's a purpose to that, and so there is a sense in which I think, okay, I recognize some of my, I'm in some of these online forums that are mostly made up of people 20, 30 years younger than me, and they can be kind of crusaders at times, and there's a part of me that says, okay, I'm going to respect that they've got age on their side when it comes to some of those things, and they also understand some of what's going on among people their own age in the culture, as long as they'll also understand some of the wisdom of age as well. and so there's some of that. There's always a little bit of a balance, and perhaps it's a good thing to have that. So accepting that, I do think back to Mouw's comments and his talking about the text from 1 Peter 2 and 1 Peter 3 really is a helpful way for us to then think about how do we engage, and that humility, kindness, and love are, when we make sure that that's primary in how we engage with people. It doesn't mean we're going to, I've heard people say, well, true love for people would confront them about their sin. And there is some truth to that, right? I mean, if you really love someone and they're engaging in very destructive behavior, you're not going to just say, oh, I love you and it's okay, you do whatever you want, and even if it causes you to have all sorts of problems and health problems and maybe even die. That's not love. But it is also true that typically, even in circumstances where people are behaving destructively, a harsh face towards them doesn't turn things around. That people still respond best to a loving rebuke. And understanding that I'm here for you, even in your worst hour, I'm here. I'm not going to judge you into, and say you're just off to hell forever. I'm always going to be here for you, but in being here for you, this is what I hope you can hear from me. And that's difficult. I get it. It's hard. It's the same thing. You raise a child and the child behaves improperly and you get angry. and sometimes, and I know that at times in raising my own kids, that anger took more precedence than the humble care, and that didn't always work out so well. Fortunately, I think my kids sort of understood that at times. But, there is a sense that really trying to speak the truth in a gentle and humble way, saying things like, I could be wrong about this, but here's why I think I'm not. And then listening to people, that humility to be willing to engage in that listening behavior and to take people where they are, I think is helpful. It really is. I have in my life, I've got a couple of people that I've been close with or am, who really do reject traditional Christianity in various ways. And of course, I'm concerned for them. These are people that I love in different ways. Some of them may be family members, some of them may be friends, coworkers, but I care deeply for them, and it's my desire that all the people that I've ever met with ever are become Christians and are in heaven with me in the new heavens and the new earth. And so those who don't show that at this point, how do you deal with them? Well, I found over the years that a humble response, a willingness to engage without giving up, without saying, okay, fine, whatever you say, that's fine. But still being willing to know that there are certain times that it's not going to be helpful to push it further. Sometimes realizing there's that old saying, and it's they say, I'm trying to remember exactly how it goes. Preach the gospel, use words as if necessary. And there's some, I recognize there are people who criticize that statement for very good reasons. But the point behind it is that often the way we live our lives and the way that we try to consistently live according to what we say we believe often has as much, if not more, impact than the words we preach. That doesn't mean we don't ever preach, right? I think that's the criticism to that statement. That is a true criticism. We do have to use words at some time. There is special revelation in addition to common grace, and we need those words, and it's only through those words that we come to know the actual salvation message, the gospel message. And yet, there is also a role for that humble, gentle, live your life in the way that the Gentiles see you and are impressed. And, that sometimes means thinking about how am I going to engage in this particular situation, in this particular milieu where the people are sort of, doing things this way. How might we learn to use some of the same concerns? Because let's be frank, even the pagans have concerns that are real concerns, and they can have insights. That's what this book is about, is common grace. There are insights that the quote unquote pagans may have that we can engage with, and even where, at times where Christians have failed to recognize that has happened and not feel that we have to defend everything every Christian has ever done, because we can't. Because just as we believe that non-Christians are in the need of salvation, we also believe that we Christians are in the need of salvation as well. And without the Holy Spirit, we are just as lost as anyone, just as lost as the Satanist who is creating circles and burning animals and that kind of thing. We're just as lost as that person without the grace of God. And so gracefully showing, gently showing, humbly showing that grace is going to get us further. Now, there may be times, Jesus flipped over the tables in the temple, right? There may be times when that kind of behavior is needed. I think you think of the civil rights movement, right? And there were times, even though it was primarily a nonviolent movement and it was very successful because of that, there was also a time for direct action, right? Whether it was the sit-ins, things like that. There was a time for that. And there will be that for us as well. But just as the civil rights movement had the opportunity for direct action, but also was very much about gentle, passive is maybe not the right word, but gentle response, and not about a revolution. And that's why it was so successful. I think that's the way we as Christians need to think in this world as well. Brock, one of the things I just wanted to mention too, and I'll turn it over to you on this a little bit. I appreciated that you were talking a little bit about the section on Calvinist empathy, and that really was a wonderful section. Right before that is a section that he entitled Agents of Common Grace. And I really liked this section as well. And the point here that Mouw makes is that as Christians, we aren't just sort of sitting back watching what the Holy Spirit is doing, but we are actually agents of God's common grace. Mouw puts it this way: we should not just stand back and watch for signs that God is restraining sin in the world, or hope that we might witness acts of civic righteousness popping up here and there in the lives of the unredeemed. We ought to look for ways God can use us to restrain the power of sin in the larger human community and to perform our own works of civic good. And Mouw talks about John Calvin's views on the magistrate, saying that those views reflect this needed sense of activity. Calvin said, "No one ought to doubt that civil authority is a calling, not only holy and lawful before God, but also the most sacred and by far the most honorable of all callings in the whole life of mortal men." John Calvin is basically saying being involved in government is one of the most honorable callings that there can possibly be. My grandpa might have disagreed with them, but it might have been a little harder for him to disagree with John Calvin than it would have been to disagree with my father, for example. But Mouw says, look, this is the case. Look at what Calvin says. But there's more. Common grace ministries are not restricted to the political realm. Abraham Kuyper pointed to broader areas of service when he referred to the Christian obligation to continually expand the dominance of nobler and purer ideals in civil society by the courageous action of its members in every area of life. And so you have Calvin saying, hey, it's great for Christians to be involved as civil magistrates, to be involved in the government. And then Kuyper takes it a step further and he says, yeah, it is. And it's also great for Christians to engage in that way in all sorts of other areas of life and to engage in that society and continually expand the dominance of these nobler and purer ideals in all areas of life. And so the Christian psychologist who encourages her non-Christian clients to honor commitments, the Christian literature professor at a secular university who highlights themes in a novel that celebrate faithfulness and telling the truth, the Christian corporate manager who instills the will to serve in employees, the Christian farmer who employs specific agricultural methods that demonstrate respect for the integrity of the creation. All of these and many more promote the goodness associated with common grace. And so Mouw says we should not confine our attention then to how unbelievers on occasion perform those deeds that better the lot of other human beings. We should also think about ways in which we, as Christians ourselves, in performing righteous acts that affect the lives of unbelievers, can promote the gifts of common grace. And Mouw takes that, a couple of further steps in talking about various areas of life. But, this idea that we are agents of common grace, that what our lives are about is serving God, expressing the glory of God by being agents of that common grace. Now, doesn't mean we aren't also agents of special grace at times. Be a missionary every day, as I learned when I went to Bible school as a kid. But being a missionary every day, telling the world that Jesus is the way, is about not just preaching the gospel of salvation. It is also about these things that Mouw talks about, the Christian psychologist, the Christian literature professor, the Christian corporate manager, the Christian farmer, engaging in these faithful Christian practices in ways that serve the community. And in doing so, we are agents of common grace. And that is our calling. That is part of our calling as Christians, that we can't ignore that calling to be agents of common grace. So I just wanted to, also call attention to that particular section of this chapter, because it just is really meaningful. And I think what I really appreciate is how Mouw takes, I think most Christians will say things like, a Christian farmer should be the best farmer they can be, and a Christian shoemaker should be the best shoemaker they should be, quoting Luther, right? But Mouw takes this even beyond that and says, but why? Why? It's because we are agents of this common grace, of this love that God shows to all of his world. And so I really appreciated that particular section of this chapter. Brock, are there any other things that you'd like to potentially highlight in this chapter, or, as we start to wrap up our discussion here, are things that you want to make sure that we don't miss in this wonderful chapter of this book by Richard Mouw?
One last aspect of this, because you covered it so well, is I think perhaps nowhere else is the crusading paradigm more obviously not the right way to go than in our own personal witness and testimony to family members. So I have many family members who are not believers, who have openly rejected my efforts to proselytize them. And if the crusading bit is supposed to work, well, the family situation really reveals, I think, a situation that maybe contradicts that. Now, again, like you pointed out, I'm glad we have people taking stand for the truth in the culture. I'm glad we have people paying the price. And I'm so in a position with my witness to my own family members where that's not had the sort of desired effect. I've talked with family members. I haven't actually gotten to the point where I was so aggressive in my outreach to them that I burned the relationship, but I've pushed. And I just cannot slice. I cannot slice my relatives with my sword into the kingdom. And if it's that way with relatives, how much perhaps more so is it with people who have no special kinship relationship with me? And so, again, none of this is to say that we should never be crusading. It's more along the lines of to emphasize what Professor Mouw says in this example. There is a messiness to our Calvinist witness to our family and in the culture. And so in that regard, this chapter was a balm to my heart and to my soul. I have several family members who are very long in the tooth, not long for this world, who are not saved. And boy, you want to talk about prayer. What other option is there? If I storm their house with my sword and pull it out, will I gain a convert? Or will I just push them away? So those are the kinds of issues. It's a messy situation. Mouw gives us something that, listen, I get it. I can see why our crusading brothers say we need more sword work to advance the kingdom. But I also just feel this satisfaction with the simplicity of that, and think Mouw brings a more mature situational awareness, for lack of a better term. So let me throw it over to you, Chuck, for some final thoughts and a prayer.
Yeah, that messiness, that Calvinist messiness that that Mouw talks about. It's a reality, and it's something that we need to live into. But as Mouw says, it ought not to trouble us, because the experience of theological messiness should be a healthy reminder of the ways in which all of our theological probings will eventually bring us to a humble acknowledgement of the divine mysteries. And so, yeah, we live in that messiness. But in that messiness, Mouw also says that we can only answer the questions that are raised because of that messiness by continuing to rely on discernment. We have to spend time discerning God's will, discerning the best way to deal with these circumstances. And that discernment is best done deeply rooted in the community of God's redeemed people. And what I love is, once again, that picture brings us back to what we talked about earlier, the confluence of the idea that we are in the world, we're engaging the world with our beliefs, but we're also gathering together as a Christian community. And those two things go together. They're not opposite things. There is a time for us to gather within our Christian communities and to be deeply rooted in that community of God's redeemed people, because it's there that we can build each other up and help each other to discern how we engage. And then it gives us strength then to go out into the world and to be agents of God's common grace in that world. And so I love that picture. Before I close in prayer, I just want to read, Brock, a poem that I found, and it's maybe not directly related to any of the single points that we've talked about today in this chapter, but in just this idea of seeking the common good. This poem that I found, entitled Inspiration, that was written by Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a Christian author, poet, and I felt that this poem sort of gives us a sense of that idea of humility and living in the world, gathering and scattering. And so it's entitled Inspiration. And this is how the poem reads. The grace that is the health of creatures can only be held in common. In healing, the scattered members come together. In health, the flesh is graced. The holy enters the world. The task of healing is to respect oneself as a creature, no more and no less. The creature is not a creator and cannot be. There is only one creation, and we are its members. To be creative is only to have health, to keep oneself fully alive in the creation, to keep the creation fully alive in oneself, to see the creation anew, to welcome one's part in it anew. Most creative works are all strategies of this health. Works of pride by self-called creators with their premium on originality reduce the creation to novelty, the faint surprises of minds incapable of wonder. Pursuing originality, the would-be creator works alone. In loneliness, one assumes a responsibility for oneself that one cannot fulfill. Novelty is a new kind of loneliness. There is the bad work of pride. There is also the bad work of despair, done poorly out of the failure of hope or vision. Despair is the too little of responsibility, as pride is the too much. The shoddy work of despair, the pointless work of pride equally betray creation. They are wastes of life. For despair, there is no forgiveness, and for pride, none. One cannot forgive oneself, and who in loneliness can forgive? Good work finds the way between pride and despair. It graces with health. It heals with grace. It preserves the given so that it remains a gift. By it, we lose loneliness. We clasp the hands of those who go before us and the hands of those who come after us. We enter the little circle of each other's arms and the larger circle of lovers whose hands are joined in a dance, and the larger circle of all creatures passing in and out of life who move also in a dance, to a music so subtle and vast that no ear hears it except in fragments. Let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, you are a God of grace, a God of special saving grace, God of that common grace, that health of creatures that can only be held in common. We praise you and we thank you for that grace. May your Spirit help us to find that good work that lies between the sins of pride and of despair. Heal us with your grace and grace us with health so that we also can grace others with health and heal others with grace. Enable us to be agents of that grace, agents of that healing in this world. This we ask in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.